Good afternoon, everyone. It's very nice to see you here. I will begin the webinar now as I think we have enough participants. So I will share my screen. Great. Thank you, everyone, for joining today. And thank you to the European Chamber of Commerce in Korea for inviting me. My name is Yuna Chang. I am the Career Program Manager at the global climate think tank InfluenceMap. So I'm really happy to be here and to present today. So today's webinar will be on the topic of climate policy in South Korea, looking ahead to 2023 or the next 9 months, and different corporate advocacy opportunities, particularly looking at kind of climate policy leadership that the corporate sector in Korea could take and the positive influence it could have. So thank you again for inviting me today. Before I begin, I believe there are a few housekeeping points. So the webinar will be recorded and we will share the slides afterwards as well. So please note this, and it will be around a 40-minute presentation and a 20-minute Q&A. But please feel free to put questions in the chat box anytime during the presentation too. So without further ado, I will begin. Just to quickly run through the agenda, I'm hoping to keep the presentation with plenty of time for Q&A, but if you share questions during the presentation, I'll try my best to answer them as I go as well. So the presentation today will be an introduction to InfluenceMap and what we do, as well as net zero, and then also introduce the topic of net zero and corporate climate policy engagement, as well as tracking corporate climate policy advocacy in South Korea, which is the work we do. So we'll do a deep dive into that, and then go into also key South Korean climate policy areas in 2023, look at industry reactions to it and what opportunities there might be. So, oh, apologies. Just to quickly go through who we are. We are a global think tank, philanthropically funded. All our funders are available to view on our website. And we are an independent think tank founded in 2015 on the eve of the Paris Agreement. We are based in London with offices in New York, Tokyo, Seoul, and team members in Canberra. And we have two key areas of research. One is LobbyMap, which is where we look at corporate climate policy engagement, and also FinanceMap, which tracks the finance sector's influence over the climate change. So today I'm going to be mostly talking about LobbyMap, which looks at corporate influence over climate policy. Yes, as part of this program, our database covers 450 companies and 250 industry associations globally. So we've got a really wide, broad global understanding of the corporate sector's interaction with climate policy. So we kind of see our work as complementing the great work already done in the wider ecosystem of climate data providers. So if you look at this pie chart here, we see that these examples of some climate data providers, which are looking mostly at how companies' climate transition plans are regarding their operational emissions and their business model, which includes scope 3 and supply chains and end use as well. But InfluenceMap tries to complement this by providing data on how companies impact net zero goals through their influence on policy and wider narratives around climate change. So what that is, in a nutshell, is to think of it as a company's carbon policy footprint. So I'm sure you're all aware of kind of scope 1, 2, and 3, including the company's own operational emissions, and also scope 3, which is currently getting a lot of attention in terms of supply chains and end use. So what InfluenceMap measures can be seen as expanding this out even more. We could think of it as scope 4, And it's the idea that companies can have a far wider influence on the trajectory of climate change than just its own emissions, through how it can support or block policies that will transition the wider economy towards carbon neutrality. And this isn't just our idea, this has been referenced extensively, including in the latest IPCC report, where it called out the influence of vested interests in the passage of climate policy globally as a key delay in achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement. In terms of climate policy engagement and a company's carbon policy footprint, it could be a large footprint if it's actively blocking ambitious climate policy, or a small or even negative footprint if it's actively supporting and promoting climate policies that will allow whole economies or industries to transition to net zero. So this is what InfluenceMap sets out to measure. And to date, when we formed in 2015, there had been no systematic way to capture and aggregate what a company's influence over climate policy is. So this data that we produce to systematize this is used by investors, companies, policymakers to shift global industry towards more Paris-aligned climate policy engagement. So just to kind of go into more detail on why corporate policy engagement is important when talking about climate policy. So, and also the net zero transition in general, which is what I'm sure we all care about here today. One is that corporate policy engagement can be seen as a proxy for governance. So is the company engaging with a policy in a way that is consistent with the climate targets it has set? It can be seen as an indicator of willingness to drive climate action through the whole organization, and to also kind of be confident in advocating for the whole society's net zero transition as well. So often it is used, our data is used by investors in this sense to have a kind of additional perspective on a company's transition goals. Corporate policy engagement also presents a systemic risk. So lobbying on climate can lead to significant systemic risks. For example, when renewable energy market growth that can be stunted artificially by obstructing vested interests. Understand what's going on to see what systemic risks there might be. There's also company and sector risks. So regulatory capture can lead to stagnancy in legacy business models that may be threatened by climate change and the climate political landscape. And also our data is used to assess climate and ESG, used in assessments for climate and ESG funds. A lot of funds have started using an understanding of lobbying activities by companies to screen for climate and ESG funds, for example, Elgin's Future World Fund. So I don't want to go into this for too much, but just to summarize how we actually do this before going into how it applies to Korea. So to explain our methodology, our definition of policy engagement is based on the 2014 UN Guide for Responsible Corporate Engagement in Climate Policy. This includes what we traditionally might think of as climate policy engagement, including lobbying, so hiring lobbyists or companies directly lobbying government officials, but also things such as communications, funding of research, advertising, and direct meetings with policymakers, anything that can influence the conversation and passage of climate policy. So we note that third-party lobbying in Korea is banned by law, which means you can't hire a third party to lobby for you. But in our research, we have found that Korean companies and industry associations engage in all other activities that are permitted in Korea to engage with climate policy issues. So they are definitely inputting on a technical basis, position papers, press releases and communications showing the industry perspective on climate policy. We define climate policy as past, currently, and currently evolving and potential future policy measures, which are motivated by the UNFCCC process, i.e. Getting the global community to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. And we assess companies and industry associations individually, and we assess them using a variety of publicly accessible data sources. And we weight recent evidence more heavily. So while everything is kind of logged on our online database, the more recent evidence will weight more highly to a company's score and assessment, which I will talk about in a bit. So the data sources you can see here include communications on their main website. So we look at sustainability reports and other kind of papers that the company publishes, their social media, which includes press releases, tweets, blog posts, anything, their CDP responses, direct consultation with governments, which includes meetings that are reported on in the Korean government, for example, reliable media reports with accredited media sources, and so on and so forth. So by doing this, these are all publicly available. We are aggregating them to gain a clear picture of where a company stands on climate-aligned Paris-aligned climate policy. So we collect evidence of climate policy engagement organized into different queries or topics. So you can see these here. It is a really wide range, so you can check lots of different things, including high-level issues such as the communication of climate science, alignment with the IPCC on the need for drastic climate action, that is net zero by carbon neutrality by 2050, support of the UN climate process, but then going into deeper, more detailed policy areas such as carbon tax, emissions trading, renewable energy. And we also track companies' positions on the energy transition and zero carbon technologies. One thing that's important to note here is that InfluenceMap doesn't take its own position on climate policies. So each evidence item is individually scored against external Paris-aligned benchmarks. So to go into more detail on this, it can be government policy benchmarks, for example, the EU ETS, or in the Korean example, the Korean ETS. We take what the government announces as the original ambition of the policy, and then we essentially assess companies against whether they support more ambition for that policy or less. So it's all relative. We're not passing a value judgment on the policy or what the it's not kind of our opinion. It is just showing on a relative scale whether a company supports more or less ambition for that policy. And the second type of benchmark we use is science-based benchmarks from globally mandated bodies such as the IPCC. So, for example, statements on certain fuels in the energy mix and the IPCC's prediction for that particular technology's trajectory in a 1.5 degree pathway. And again, relative to that, where a company stands on the role of that. So our evidence is scored on a 5-point scale from -2 to +2. So it's not binary. We know these things are complicated. It's not a yes or no of whether a company supports it. There are degrees of support, and so we try to capture this nuance as much as possible. So just to look at some key metrics, this is an example of a European company, Unilever, which scores fairly highly on our system. So these are available for every single company on our database, and these are all publicly and freely available online. So just to break down exactly what we provide in terms of a climate policy assessment, there's the performance band, which is a full measure of a company's climate policy engagement. And that breaks down into an organization score and a relationship score. An organization score is a measure of how supportive or obstructive a company is towards Paris-aligned climate policy in its direct activities. So what company A is saying with regards to all the different policies that are being suggested and proposed by governments. A relationship score looks at how supportive or obstructive a company's industry associations are towards Paris-aligned climate policy. So that we often call an indirect influence over climate policy. And these are aggregated. So we record all of a company's industry association memberships where they're publicly disclosed. and then we weight them by strength of relationships. So for example, we assume we note that if a company is a chairperson of an association or sits on the board of that association, they might have a stronger relationship and influence over the association's positions, whereas if they're just an ordinary member, and so we weight that in our relationship score. And then engagement intensity is an agnostic measure, so it's not a value judgment, it just shows how strong the company's engagement is. So it's not positive or negative, it is how often and how actively they are engaging with climate policy. So all this kind of goes into kind of several online resources that we have. So this is just an overview of some of the main ones that we have, showing our main regional coverage. And we also have separate sector tools as well that you can see here, most notably our automotive climate tool, but also other ones as well. So one of the key, so we produce all these profiles and we then kind of aggregate this into reports and other outputs that may be useful to our stakeholders. So one of the key things that we release, one of our flagship kind of outputs, is the global A-list of climate policy engagement. So there's lots of recognizable European companies and possibly a fair few ECCK members here. The aim of this report is to highlight and showcase best practice examples of ambitious Paris-aligned climate policy engagement, which will help to shift not only the company, but the wider economy towards the goal of a 1.5-degree world. So we note that the more that kind of best practice knowledge around climate policy engagement is shared, the more actively a larger number of companies raise their voice, the more effectively the needle can shift towards effective climate policy. So through the rest of the presentation, I'll come back to this idea of kind of best practice climate policy engagement, and also look at opportunities there might be for corporate leadership with climate policy in Korea as well. So there's no need to explain why Korea is such a crucial economy in the global fight against climate change. It's in framing it towards ECCK members, it's a huge market for global companies, and also the Korean economy is an essential part of the global supply chain, and it's a home to the development of cutting-edge zero carbon technologies as well. So there is so much potential here, and I want to share with you some insights on South Korean climate policy from our research, which is all hosted on this online platform on Korea. So this was launched last year, and it essentially hosts the 15 data on the 15 largest companies and the 15 largest industry associations representing them in Korea. So we decided these companies through a cross reference of the Forbes 2000 list, so the largest companies by market cap, and national GHG emissions database, so the companies that are the heaviest emitters and therefore most crucial in South Korea's carbon neutral transition. So by having the data of these kind of crucial climate policy industry areas on the platform, we hope to allow investors, policymakers, and companies themselves to understand the landscape of industry engagement with climate policy in South Korea. And this is available, this kind of regional platform is available for the EU, US, and Japan as well. So the aim of this is to understand where the blockages are in climate policy, where consensus has not been yet built, and also to be able to easily see what kind of reasons industries are using to promote or oppose policy. But it's also useful for identifying allies. So by showing companies and associations that are already being proactive and positive on climate policy. So it's aiming to also kind of foster leadership communities as well and opportunities. So just to look quickly at the industry trends that we see on the Korea platform. This chart plots the 15 industry associations representing the Korean companies on the platform. So the x-axis, the horizontal axis shows the climate performance band, So how aligned or misaligned the industry association's climate policy positions are with the goals of the Paris Agreement. With this way becoming increasingly misaligned, and this beyond this mark being aligned with the goals. The vertical axis shows the engagement intensity, which was previously explained, how actively the company is acting, or the industry association. So what we see here is that most industry associations' climate policy engagement activities in Korea are unfortunately misaligned with achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement. So there's clearly more that can be done for a push for strong climate policy in Korea. There's several ways this can be explained. Often industry associations, we call it the lowest common denominator effect, may end up representing the views of the kind of most negative views, or the most conservative, with a small c, views of their members. But also what we found is that some industry members may have certain louder voices within the industry association as well. So often the negative voices are winning through. And this is a trend that is actually global. Lots of industry associations tend to be more negative than the companies, a lot of the companies that they represent. We also note here that this only includes Korean industry associations and not yet foreign chambers of commerce, such as ECCK, which are also kind of contributing to the climate policy discussion as well. The most positive industry association on this chart, at least, is the Korean New and Renewable Energy Association. But compared to the most negative industry associations that are charting on here, which includes FKI and KAMA, you see that the engagement intensity of the positive industry association is comparatively lower. So, and meanwhile, industry associations representing South Korea's cutting edge technologies, such as battery industry, semiconductor industry, which take up a huge amount of the contribute a huge amount to the South Korean economy, they're basically remaining quiet. So it's a very low engagement intensity, and the D score indicates their silence more than their actual position, because their engagement intensity is so low. And so what it seems is that currently in Korea, the negative voices are more active and more loudly heard than the positive voices, and potential areas, potential industries that could be a positive voice maybe aren't making their voice heard as much as could be possible. So what does that mean for climate policy in Korea this year? So all eyes are on the carbon neutral green growth framework, which is due to be announced hopefully in the next week or so. So this plan is expected to provide the national carbon neutrality strategy and annual emissions reduction targets by sector as well, for each industry. So it's going to be very important for setting targets and investments around implementing the 2050 carbon neutrality target. So it's important for that reason, and also because as an overarching strategy, it's likely to have a knock-on effect on the discussions around other policies, such as the Korea Emissions Trading Scheme, the implementation perhaps of a carbon tax or carbon pricing mechanisms, the renewable energy target, and also industry decarbonization strategies as well. So I want to share with you the analysis that is available on our South Korean climate policy tracker, which shows insights on the current landscape of climate policy and industry attitudes towards them. So the Korea Policy Tracker, our tracker tracks major climate policy areas under discussion and how South Korean industry is responding to it. So as you can see, there's the overarching targets, such as the 2050 and 2030 NDC. There's renewable energy policy, and by clicking on these policies, you can see firstly details on all the different policies that are under that policy area, and also a summary of industry kind of positions on it. So these graphs are updated live and show the spread of industry positions on that policy as benchmarked by government ambition and IPCC science. So we hope that by seeing this in one graphic, it can be used to identify opportunities for a coordinated industry push in favor of strong climate policies, or identify areas where there is still a split consensus and needs more work, essentially. So, for example, you can see here that there is increasing support among Korean industry for stronger renewable energy policy, and also transport policy and transport decarbonization policy as well, which are areas that ECCK, for example, has engaged with through its policy white papers. So I wanted to deep dive into some of these policies today. So the Korean renewable energy policy, I'm sure many of you are familiar, but we'll just overview, is a patchwork of different policies, including that are under the basic energy plan. But options for procuring renewable energy include several different things, such as the green premium system, and with increasing options for purchasing renewable energy certificates or some form of PPAs, such as third-party PPAs. As many of you will know, the renewable energy target was lowered at the end of last year, and Korea currently has a very low share of renewables. However, our research shows that there is a clear industry demand for government renewables policy. So not only are companies setting renewable, for example, RE100 targets, but global companies are also clearly stating the demand for actual support and investment in the renewables sector. So the graph on the right shows a distribution of company positions regarding the need for renewable energy. So support for active government investment and reform of renewable energy provision is actually extremely high. There's clear industry demand for stronger renewables infrastructure, and this is obviously crucial not only for domestic climate targets, but also for many global companies' supply chain targets. So how does corporate climate policy engagement currently around this issue work in detail? So our research finds that the direct corporate engagement with this issue has mostly been around the functionality and improvement of existing solutions, such as reforming of the green premium, of PPAs. So essentially around the practicalities of procurement rather than calling for stronger and more ambitious investment overall. This is changing slightly with increased advocacy for actual infrastructure investments and incentives around renewable energy procurement to put them on a level playing field with fossil fuels. So this is going beyond kind of piecemeal suggestions and actually becoming a stronger voice for climate ambition in this area. So the most detailed proposals, and when the slides are shared later, you can actually click on these and view the direct statement on our system, as it's all logged as evidence. But the most detailed proposals come from the KNREA, with it's been advocating, for example, for detailed overhauls to the renewable energy policy, including more deep-rooted changes such as grid reform and reform of bidding markets and things like that. And we also note that the ECCK white paper last year advocated for long-term investment and incentivization of renewable energies, in particular offshore wind in Korea. So when these voices are all taken into consideration, there is potential in Korea for a strong industry voice that points to both the need for ambitious targets and long-term investments alongside the short-term reforms to regulations. It's all there. And we note that this is a really strong opportunity for companies to coordinate and show that industry willingness to invest in renewable energy policy. The next policy I wanted to deep dive into is the zero emissions vehicle policy area. So the current government has indicated that this is an area of interest with the announcement of a 2035 ZEV transition target, although there's no clear date yet for phasing out of internal combustion engine vehicles. But there are clear targets to produce more electric vehicles and try and decarbonize the road transport sector. So 2023 seems to be a year with a lot of details of the EV transition policy that could be decided. what we see on in the graph profile on ZEV policy is that there is more of a mix when it comes to positions. So there's clear support, but also kind of some opposition as well. When we go into more detail with this data, though, we find that actually there is broad support for electric vehicle infrastructure and kind of electrification from a broad range of bodies, while the opposition is actually concentrated only in a few bodies. So, for example, the Korea Chamber of Commerce and Industry and the Federation of Korean Industries, both very important cross-sector industry associations, have shown broad support for electric vehicle infrastructure. And meanwhile, the active voice of the active opposition to phasing out, for example, internal combustion engine vehicles and a longer term role for that over electrification comes mostly from the Korea Autos Association and the Korea Petroleum Association. But while the traditional kind of ICE vehicle industries may be showing more resistance, Korea is also the seat of industry that is crucial to the electrification transition of the transport sector. So we found that the EV and battery industry associations have actually barely voiced any positions on ZEV or wider climate policy. So presumably they would also support electric vehicle infrastructure and incentives and policy around that, but we're not sure yet because they haven't publicly been as active in this area. But given the broad support from large cross-sector industry associations, it seems that if there was more coordinated action to voice support for ZEV policy from industry in Korea, this mixed consensus could shift towards a more supportive outcome. And we do note that the new chairman of the Korea Automobile Manufacturers Association has, since the beginning of this year, been more actively voicing support for government investment in electric vehicle infrastructure. So it seems that the trend is going more towards supporting that area and also being more ambitious on how this can actually lead to the phase out of internal combustion engine vehicles. The last policy area to look at today is on current industry conversation around hydrogen and hydrogen-related policy in Korea. And as explained previously, our methodology tracks companies' positions and activities around not only climate policies, but also in this area, different fuels and technologies based on IPCC guidance for that particular fuel and its role in a 1.5 degree aligned pathway. So the reason we're doing a deep dive into hydrogen in particular, although we assess a lot of other, basically all other fuel types and technologies as well, is that it's a huge business area for Korea with a lot of potential for different industries, so notably steel and other hard to abate sectors, which are very important parts of the Korean economy. But not only that, there's cutting edge knowledge in Korea that can be harnessed to advance hydrogen technologies and production as well. So in Korea, the government has recognized the need for a long-term strategy around hydrogen. So we've got the hydrogen economy roadmap already in place and an updated hydrogen and ammonia roadmap under discussion. So there is clearly a will from government to invest in hydrogen technologies and make this a key part of Korea's energy transition. So a key focus in Korean policy this year, we forecast to be where a discussion around where this investment goes. So what type of hydrogen gets supported and how the limited supply of hydrogen that we currently have will be most effectively used and where it will be forecast to be used. So just to kind of return to the IPCC guidance on hydrogen, which is what we use to benchmark companies' statements on hydrogen in the energy mix. So to quickly run through this, the IPCC most recent working group report released in April 2022 indicates the strong potential for hydrogen in various use cases such as renewable energy storage, industrial processes, including iron ore reduction for the metal sector, all of these are highly relevant for Korea. It also, though, specifically states that the limited amount of hydrogen that we have and also the kind of energy intensive production process of hydrogen means that hydrogen should be used only for these hard to abate or unique use cases rather than being used for power generation, for example, or sectors where electrification could be more effective, such as in building heating. Secondly, the IPCC clearly outlines that the color of hydrogen matters, i.e. the process of how it's made. So green hydrogen, and that essentially the production process of hydrogen should be as close to zero carbon as possible. That is green hydrogen, hydrogen produced through biomass, or if produced with natural gas with stringent CCS technology that would absorb most of the resulting CO2. That's 80 to 90%. That is basically all of the emissions from the gas in the production process. So that is how we assess companies' positions on how they are advocating for hydrogen in the energy mix, whether that's general statements on what role hydrogen should play in Korea's energy future, but also how they are engaging with policy on that. So there are already some cases of positive advocacy from Korean industry, positive meaning aligned with the IPCC climate science. This includes requests for investments in green hydrogen infrastructure, including specifically for hydrogen-reduced steel technology. This request has come from POSCO, which has been increasingly vocal on the need for government investment in these areas, and establishment of stricter classifications for clean hydrogen as well, which I believe came from KEPCO, the power generation company. So essentially saying we need to be more ambitious in what we class as clean hydrogen for this to contribute to our net zero transition. And note here that I would note here that a lot of the advocacy in this area is very much linked. So in order to invest in green hydrogen infrastructure, we also would need strong energy policy, renewable energy policy as well. So a lot of these kind of, come together and could be advocated for in a strategic way. So lastly on this slide, I wanted to give an example of strong best practice from a European company, because there were similar debates in the EU, for example, in the EU hydrogen and gas decarbonisation package. This led to a lot of discussion about what constitutes the role for hydrogen in the EU's energy future. So here is an example where NL supported conserving the use of green hydrogen for hard to abate sectors and advocated against blending hydrogen with fossil gas, i.e. concentrating that investment on green hydrogen technology instead. And as you can see, this clearly aligns with the IPCC guidance for 1.5 degrees. So just a last couple of things before I wrap up the Q&A, and I know we've already got a question that I will aim to answer as soon as possible after this. What next? So there's clearly a lot of really exciting opportunities in Korea for decarbonisation, and also not just to decarbonize, but to also grow and profit from this transition and become a leader through this transition. So South Korea this year has a real opportunity to set a strong direction for climate transition through policy. We've seen examples of positive advocacy both in Korea but globally from both European and Korean industry. And we note that if this were coordinated and harnessed, it could be very effective. It could be a really strong voice and make Korean industry in Korea a strong pro-climate voice. Industry associations, we looked at the role of industry associations, and although sometimes they can be obstructive, we also note they can provide a conduit for collective leadership. So for example, through the ECCK, which already shows the potential for this through its publication of the white paper annually, but also through things such as thought leadership and knowledge sharing. especially as there are a lot of kind of leading companies on climate from the EU sharing this knowledge, what has worked, and expertise with South Korean industry, and vice versa, taking expertise from South Korean industry as well. So there is a lot of nascent climate policy leadership in Korea that could really come to the forefront. So I wanted to also just draw attention to this graphic, which is from a guide we have just released on net zero and the need for new leadership in corporate climate advocacy. And this is in preparation for the release of our A-List 2023 report, which will be coming out later this year. And we want to really encourage and make known the kind of steps that companies can take towards climate policy leadership. So these 5 steps to corporate climate policy leadership are based on the Global Investor Standards for Responsible Climate Lobbying, which was released in May last year. We've condensed the standards down into 5 easy steps that companies can follow. So getting kind of executive buy-in, using science-based benchmarks so that it is clear whether a company, your climate policy positions are aligning with the goals of the Paris Agreement, reviewing internally your company's climate policy positions and disclosing these transparently, addressing industry association alignments. So for example, if there are industry associations that your company is a member of that potentially are not aligning with your position on climate policy, trying to address those misalignments, and also deploying strong leadership through the variety of policy engagement tactics that are available to a company in each different region. So this is quite detailed, and I just wanted to put it on the slides for reference, but I won't go into detail. But this guide also contains best examples from all over the world, Japan, US, Europe, that show essentially examples of things that have already done. All of these steps that we've outlined have happened before. There is a strong precedent for it. It's not something that has never been done before. Companies have been showing leadership on this for years. And so there is a strong precedent and clearly a growing momentum for change that we hope can happen in Korea as well. So these are some resources, all of them kind of referring to things that I've referenced already, and they are linked so you can explore them in more detail when the slides are sent out. But with that, I will end the presentation and thank you very much. I hope to be able to answer your questions as well. And I think there is actually one already, so I can answer that first. So on the renewable energy policy, what is the maximum scale on each 5 areas? I believe this is referring to the kind of 5-point scale on the graph. Please correct me if I'm wrong. So this is the 5-point scale that the InfluenceMap methodology employs, and it essentially is the maximum is different for each policy because the maximum scale is different for each policy because, as we noted, we don't judge, we don't advocate for certain policies ourselves. We are neutral, we are policy neutral on that. We simply benchmark the company's relative position to that policy on that scale. So the maximum scale will be strongly supporting Paris-aligned climate policy or strongly supporting an IPCC aligned climate transition. So this would either mean completely being in line with all the guidance from the IPCC. So if you look at the IPCC pathways, being in line with all of that, or in the case of a government, specifically supporting that policy. So for example, if you strongly support the government's renewable energy policy that is aiming to deliver on the goals of the Paris Agreement, that will be a +2, but also or +2 as in the maximum scale of strongly supporting. But it would also be if a company was advocating for more ambition. So we support this policy, but we think you could go further. So that is why it's a relative scale. For example, this would also apply to zero emissions vehicle policy. If the government set a target, for example, for phasing out ICE vehicles, or announced a policy around electric vehicle infrastructure, then strongly supporting that policy specifically or calling for more ambition would lead to being classed on this, on the maximum side of the scale as well. So I hope that answers your question. And got another question here, which is, how does industry engagement with climate policy in Korea compare to other countries globally? It is actually very similar. I will go back to this chart. So the spread we see among industry in Korea and their kind of positions on climate policy is very similar to all regions globally. There's always going to be kind of industries that oppose climate policy for various reasons. And so especially cross-sector industries that might need to be representing a lot of views, and so on and so forth. However, what is slightly different, so this is kind of something that we've noted in all regions that we've assessed, there is still strong blockage to climate policy passage through industry opposition. But the one thing that we do note is slightly different from other regions is that in Korea there is not as much yet a strong contingent of active climate policy leaders. So there's clearly potential, and especially in terms of individual company statements, some more positive positions from individual companies, but this has not yet coalesced into a strong counterbalance against other opposing voices. This is not the case in, for example, Europe, which has a really strong and active voice from, for example, renewable energy industry associations, utilities, and other sectors such as that. And also even in Japan, closer to Korea, there is the kind of collectives and industry associations that aim to kind of actively promote the voice of climate policy leaders in industry. And so that is maybe the one difference, and something that could be worked on through kind of proactive voices such as the ECCK, European companies in Korea, and also Korean companies that have clearly demonstrated that they want more renewable energy policy and more ambition and support for industry in the transition. Another question here is, have there been any attempts to combat negative lobbying by companies around the issue of climate change? Yes, so this is an increasingly important topic, especially since the IPCC announced that it may be a clear blockage to achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement. But since before that, especially investor momentum has been growing around tackling this issue. I went through the areas of kind of systemic risk and governance as a metric for governance in my presentation, and this is something that investors are taking increasingly seriously, and that is why a global standard for responsible climate lobbying was released last year to provide that more standardized look, so that companies can more easily kind of benchmark their performance. We've also seen kind of investor pushes starting in Europe and the US and Australia. For example, most recently in Australia, there were shareholder resolutions asking certain companies to halt their lobbying for fossil fuels and align their climate policy engagement with the Paris Agreement. But also in Japan now, Toyota was the first company to be asked by investors to do a review of its climate policy engagement and to make sure and to disclose on that, and also its industry association and direct climate policy engagement activities. So this is increasingly a concern in the investor community, and increasingly in Asia as well, although it started in Europe. And also on a positive, on another positive note, there have been attempts to combat negative lobbying from the corporate sector itself. We note that there are more corporate leaders on climate policy than ever before in Korea, globally. And so while there may have been a very strong tilt towards the negative voices on climate policy, now more and more companies are firstly actively raising their voice, but secondly also reviewing their own climate policy positions, making sure they're aligned with their company targets and acting on this as well. So we've also seen an improvement in that. And please do feel free to ask more questions, but I believe that's all there is for now. So I may give back 8 minutes of your afternoon, unless there are any more questions.
Yuna, we have the question on the chat box. Several questions.
Oh, sorry. Well, I will not be giving back 8 minutes of your time. I will be answering these questions. So one other question was in the same slide, Korea automobile and chemical companies are quite behind other industries. Do you have any idea about auto and chemicals in comparison with the EU? Yes, so what we find actually is that, for example, the automobile industry, while the industry association for automobiles is very negative, for example, Hyundai Motor, the largest company, automotive company in Korea, has a much better performance. It's more in the mixed alignment category than the Automobile Manufacturers Association. That having been said, it does lag behind EU and US automobile manufacturers, and this is all kind of available to see and compare on our automotive climate tool on our website. This may be for a number of reasons. There's potentially been more investments in electric vehicles, for example, in Europe, or also areas in the US like California. But what we see is that Korea is performing slightly worse than the EU on that. The chemicals industry, the EU chemicals industry is on the more obstructive side of climate policy engagement. So we see this actually as a lot of cases where companies are, industries are coordinating globally and have very similar opinions globally on climate policy. And so we see this as kind of more similar. But we note that some petrochemical companies in Korea are becoming strong voices for renewable energy policy. For example, LG Chem has been more actively voicing support for renewable energy policy. So I can't say, I don't know as much in detail about Europe, but we hope that there will be change in this way. What is the possible action proposed as group of committee in the ECCK along with individual companies? So that's a really interesting question. I think the ECCK, as do all industry associations, have such a powerful potential for positive change because it represents many powerful and important companies that have a really good sense of the economy, are really contributing. And so I think in Korea, for example, a really important thing is active and public thought leadership on climate change. So while there are many and on climate policy, because what we've seen is that while there are many great attempts to decarbonize companies' operational emissions models in Korea, there isn't as much, and there's a lot of kind of thought leadership and public communications around that. There isn't as much on the need for strong climate policy and a need for a societal shift towards zero carbon transformation. And so what we're noting is that there's kind of lots of things that are going on under the surface, but maybe haven't kind of come more to the forefront in terms of active thought leadership and active participation in a public conversation that can not only shift policymakers' views, but also public views. That is also really important to climate policy in democracies. And so there's definitely potential for more kind of thought leadership on that, and something that's really positive and visible and can be inspirational to others as well. Is CBAM likely to implement with a huge concern in WTO compliance perspectives and conflicts between EU commissions and countries which operate their own ETS protocol? I'm not sure I can necessarily answer the second one, as we don't really comment on policy itself, but on CBAM, it's we have been tracking industry concerns around WTO compliance, although it's now been kind of deemed to be compliant with WTO. The IPCC also has guidance on the necessary considerations when implementing a CBAM, which we take into account. I can't really comment on the likelihood of it implementing, but we've seen that in Korean industry, there is now, from a kind of initial concern, there is now more a shift towards wanting to respond preemptively to that. So the industry trend seems to be shifting more towards accepting that there are going to be carbon trade tariffs in some form, and trying to a lot of the kind of companies are forward thinking and trying to respond to that. I see. I missed the second part of the question on possible actions along with individual companies like corporates such as Michelin Korea. I would say be active if there is a global position on climate policy. If Michelin Korea, for example, is, or any other company is supportive of renewable energy policy or any other thing, be vocal, be public about it, because this really changes the landscape. It shifts public opinion, shows that industry can, growth and economic success and zero carbon transition and transformation can go hand in hand. And so these kind of voices, if they are happening in your company, being heard in the public domain to policymakers and being proactive is really important. And it's something that we see a lot of potential for as well. Another thing that a company can do is follow those 5 steps. Look at your industry associations. Are they saying things that potentially don't align with your own views on climate policy? Try to address them. We know it's not a kind of one-stop issue, but it's something that can be solved with dialogue and conversation. And so review those. And also it's really useful to review your own company's positions on policy, see whether they align with your own decarbonization targets, consider whether your targets need certain support, and whether your targets mean that certain kind of climate regulations you can proactively respond to. So this is really an opportunity to really get to know your targets and think about the wider context in which your targets are being fulfilled. But really happy to chat through this in more detail one-on-one. Please feel free to email me and we can talk through that in more detail. With that, I believe the webinar time is up. If you want to hear more details on any of the questions I was answering, please do feel free to email me. I'll just go to the last slide. We are happy to have one-on-one chats or email conversations explaining the issue in more detail. If you have any questions about the resources, please feel free also to get in touch. So thank you very much. It was really great, and thank you for all the very interesting questions. And thank you again to ECCK for inviting me.